tonight we have a very special guest. Something that we're trying to do in these after shows is to go beyond a typical talk back and offer you guys some new guests that might give you some more cultural or historic context for the themes or the circumstances of the shows. So today we have Dan Rosenthal, and he's going to talk about his father's story through World War II. If you look in your programs, we have a little bit of background for you guys. We have some background on his father, Robert Rosenthal, and then a little bit about Dan on the back. And welcome, Dan.
Well, thank you. It's first off, watching this performance was so moving, and the story of survival is what took place during World War II, and this almost moved me to tears today. And through what I'm about to tell you about my father and also my mother, I hope that this will continue your education, which is so vital. And my big reason for getting involved in my father's foundation was when he was dying. He said, it's important. History needs to be preserved. And with that, started my journey in my dad's foundation. And it's the greatest single honor of my life to be able to be here to tell you a little bit about it.
We're so lucky to have you. Dan has done some incredible work in spreading this personal story, but also working to make sure it gets to a large audience. Just today, they actually announced there's a new Apple Plus, is the streamer now, Apple TV. There's a new series coming out called Masters of the Air, and that is all about the group that your father is a part of.
Yeah, you may have heard of Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg.
Just to drop a couple of names.
They did Band of Brothers, The Pacific. Well, this is their trilogy, and this is their diamond. They've said this to me. This is the diamond of the three. This tells about the air war of the B-17 bombers that flew during World War II. And with that, perhaps I can tell you a little bit about this.
Yes, please.
My father signed up immediately. He was very frustrated that the United States was not getting involved. From World War I, there was an isolationist feeling throughout the land. But when World War II hit our doorsteps, he was so relieved. He felt that he could actually do something to help defeat fascism and dictators. And so he immediately enlisted the following day. He went down and he thought, what could he do that would serve and create the most damage against Hitler? He said, I'll become a bomber pilot. Well, he didn't realize that you shouldn't ask for what you really want, because that'll never happen. Well, it did happen. Eventually, during his training, he wound up down in Florida. He was flying these planes that were trailing a target. And this was done so that the gunners could get practice. Well, these gunners stank. They would quite often hit his tail of his plane, and he was really fighting for his life before even getting over there. Well, during his off days, this is where he really learned how to fly. He and the other pilots wound up dogfighting and learning how to do chandelles and lazy S's and flying under the bridges. But that's where he really learned how to be a pilot. And that's the techniques that he learned how to do there saved his life later on. He eventually got his plane, was sent over to Europe as a replacement crew because they were in the middle of Black Week, which was where the entire 8th Air Force was almost wiped out. And I just want to back up. There were 10 guys on a plane, and you were supposed to fly 18 to 25 missions at the beginning. It was so horrific, if you were lucky to survive 8, you were well ahead of the curve. So when my father eventually arrived to the 100th Bomb Group, which nickname is the Bloody 100th, and it's not because they lost as much as some of the other groups, but when they lost big. My father's 3rd mission was to Munster, October 10th. They were going into the IP target. These planes, when they were fully loaded, the B-17s could fly up to maybe 150 miles an hour, but going into the target, you were lucky to make 130 miles an hour, and you're talking about a tremendous amount of planes up in the air. Well, what was going on, these guys in the plane had the 4 Fs that were fear, frostbite, flak, and fighters. When you were flying 5 miles above the Earth, this was relatively new. The oxygen could go bad, so every 5 minutes you were calling out to your crew to see if they were alive or conscious. Frostbite. A place in Bridgeport, Connecticut, manufactured electric blankets. They created a warm suit for them to survive 5 miles high. They were called the Blue Bunnies. You would plug them in, you would sweat profusely, and they would short out. The flak could cover the sky. You would be walking on this shrapnel, and it would pierce through these. For instance, these planes were sculptures, but you could take a pen and just easily hit it and pierce it. So again, you're going 130 miles an hour, and you're being shot at. The guns are going off, the Germans are coming at you. Well, on this mission to Munster, my dad's entire group were wiped out, except for him. He arrives at the IP, which is where you drop your bombs. He dropped them because he wasn't going to risk their lives without succeeding to go into the target. Upon that, flak hit one of his engines. He had to feather it. In other words, if he didn't lose that propeller, it would have shook the plane and the wing apart. So he did that. When he did that, however, that prop hit the next engine. And that also he had a feather. But he continued on, hooking up with another group eventually. But his airspeed, he wasn't able to keep up. So the German fighters came after him. Easy target. And they started firing at him. Well, he called on to his skills that he developed while doing those dogfights. And he did something that no one has ever done in the B-17 plane. He did chandelles, he did lazy S's, he did dives. The Germans thought he must have been crazy, and perhaps he was. but that's how he evaded his crew. And his crew, by the way, was yelling at him, "Hold on, keep a steady platform so we could shoot at him." My father said, "No way. If you can shoot at them, they can shoot at us." That's right. So they continued on their way. And over the channel, my father said, "Let's throw everything overboard." And he did, they did. And as they were getting across the channel, the third engine failed. He continued on and was able to see a base. And as he was landing, the fourth engine failed. But he landed it. His crew, they were dead on board, wounded. A rocket hole through a wing. He survived. That was his third mission. The group was decimated. They made my father go to a flak house, which was where the Red Cross women serving coffee and everything. My father didn't want to go. He needed to fly immediately. Otherwise, he feared that he and his crew would have a horrible time getting up from that point. Well, the powers that be didn't listen to him. They sent him on his way to this flak house where he had to entertain himself. Matter of fact, one officer noticed that there were golf balls and some golf clubs there. "Rosie, let's go out and hit some golf balls." And my father had never played before. And he goes out there, and the golf balls were really dirty. And he goes out and he's hitting them. Well, there were sheep also on the property. And you couldn't figure out which was the sheep turd. So he was splat. That was the last time he ever played golf. Well, my father went on to fly 52 missions.
Which is far and above what anyone else.
He signed up for 3 tours. On one mission, they were shot down. They crash landed into an embankment in between some trees. All of the officers were injured. None of the enlisted men were hurt, but he was knocked out. The French underground made sure that they all got back. He didn't wake up until he was in hospital in England. On his other mission, you're going to have to watch the miniseries.
I'm so excited too.
It is a fascinating way of telling history. History is not taught properly, as we all know. And Hanks and Spielberg are going to make sure that people understand the horrors that these guys flew. After the war, my father was recruited by Paul Tibbets. He also was a good friend of General Doolittle. Coming back to Florida, he started training to fly the B-29s. He was in line to fly with the Enola Gray. He wasn't called for that mission, so he retired. He drove back from Florida. He bought himself a convertible. And as driving back from Florida, he was pulled over. He couldn't understand. And the officer comes over to him and says, "You know how fast you were going?" And my father said, "I have no idea." He said, "You were going 10 miles an hour." My father could care less. He was a lawyer before the war. He resumed his law practice back in New York City after the war, but began to unravel from what he endured. In one of the papers, the Herald, he saw that they were looking for prosecutors at the Nuremberg war tribunals. And he immediately did the paperwork and signed up and went down to the Brooklyn Navy Yard where he was to board a boat and depart from there to go to Nuremberg. The boat was delayed, even though the gangplank was pulled up. This woman in a Jeep drives in with all of her luggage and puts all of her stuff on top of the cargo crates, hoisted up on board. That was my mother. She was never, ever early for anything.
Right place, right time to meet our soulmate, though, to say.
My father used to say, I knew I was falling in love, but I wasn't sure if it was seasickness or death. My father in Nuremberg prosecuted and did investigative work on Goering, Keitel, and Jodl, the three remaining heads of the Nazi regime. It gave my father great satisfaction to interrogate Goering in his jail cell, even though he was still thinking he was God's gift. But my father, being a Jew, had the great honor of going in there and interrogating. My mother did investigative work on I.G. Farben there, as we all heard in the play. There, the Germans kept incredible records of the atrocities that they committed. And one that she lectured on was how much cement a uterus could hold before it would burst on live individuals. These are the people that they fought against. It's important to remember the history, because after my parents were married by the Burgermeister of Nuremberg, they went up to Eagle's Nest and honeymooned up there. And my mother wore a Lederhosen and did a jig. But I want you to know, today, Goering's house is now a hotel and is quite popular, beautiful. But underneath, there are these tunnels that they use to go back and forth to one another's homes to orchestrate the war and the killing of so many. So be careful. Don't let history get awash by the greenery of the new growth. It's important to remember what's underneath there and to teach your families the history of this. It's unfortunate that the schools don't teach the history of these things properly. And that's why it is my greatest honor to be able to work with Hanks and Spielberg and Jessica. One of your own here worked on Masters of the Air at the very beginning with the screenwriter. But it's important that we remember this history. In addition to that, I just want to tell you, in our foundation, one of the ways I wanted to reach out to a new audience was to think about how best to do that. And through our foundation, we are working with one of the largest video gamers in the world, and they have a game called the Mighty Eighth Air Force. And they have now, this coming year, going to put out the Mighty Eighth Air Force featuring the Bloody 100th. And there you will learn, part of their goal is to teach future generations about the real missions that our guys flew. And that's one of my goals, is to have that type of education for generations to come. So thank you.
Absolutely. I feel honored just to hear you speak about this and tell the story, and I love that you're going into these different mediums to get that story out there, video games and TV series, and what we're trying to do with theater, you know, how do we use art to teach these people, and I think of the theater and other places where you're consuming art is like where you build empathy and you learn empathy. So I'm just so happy to hear that there are people who are really trying to get this out there.
And one last thing I want to tell you is our group has been reinstated back in today's Air Force, and it's the 100th Air Refueling Wing that flies out of England. And part of their mission statement is to teach these young cadets and officers and pilots that fly a lot of surveys all over for NATO and other parts of the world, to teach them of the legacy. And they have, on all of their planes, they have put nose art of all of the original planes from our group as part of the legacy.